Hello, humanities. Here I am with your second recording of the day. This is going to get into more like our first topic, hitting race relations. If you do have any notes going for a humanities class, now would be a good time to continue to have them out. Hopefully, you watch my other video first. There's a few terms that I'll throw at you. Remember, my notes you will be able to use them for any assessments, quizzes, or like the semester exam. Okay, I'm going to walk you through like a slides presentation. And please know that like if you've had my history class before, you know I have a tendency to get long-winded. I'm trying to be mindful of your time, and I'm going to try to get through this pretty brief and be concise. But I have a tendency to babble on. This is like my third take of it, and I'm trying to like really crunch it down so I'm not just rambling on too long for you, to be mindful of your time. All right, I'm going to kill the webcam now because you really don't need to see my face. It's more important that you see what's on the screen and you hear my voice through this, and I'll kind of guide you through like the key things that you would want to have written down. So one of the first topics we're hitting in class is going to be race relations. That's obviously a hot button issue that's really tying into the election today and all the current event stuff going on in our country and in the world. I'm going to give you a real brief, like kind of history of racism in America and kind of look at it like from a global perspective and from more of an American perspective. I'm not going to dig too deep into that because, that's what U.S. history class and world history class is for. But I think it is relevant to like what's playing out today, current events wise. And then we're going to look more deeply and kind of the current situation here in 2020. That'll be your journal question today. Will kind of tie into that stuff. And then probably several of the other lessons we're doing this week will be more looking at like current events type stuff and how that narrative's all playing out. All right, so key terms for you. A few things that I think you should definitely have in your notes that we will come back to, just like if you had taken notes on bias and tribalism last week, where I said everybody has bias. That's like having an opinion. That's a key thing that we're going to reference back to. Just knowing that vocabulary will be important for moving all the way through the semester, and it'll tie into pretty much every unit we do. These terms, I think, will also come into play quite a bit, so you'd want to know them. So first off, a binary choice. I think humans, especially Americans, we like to frame things as binary choices. So a binary choice is kind of what it sounds like. It means like two options, like something is black or white, yes or no. Or for an American like political perspective, we really have two choices. I know there's more minor parties out there, but really all the big candidates for any major office typically are going to be a Republican or a Democrat. So we have that binary choice. You got two options. That's very simple. It's easy for the human brain to understand. We typically like binary choices, even though I think we're kind of selling ourselves short by only having two options. I guess I have some beef with that because I tend to think, going on to the second term, that most things have way more like nuance. And nuance is like all the subtle little differences, the details. I think most of like the issues we'll cover in this class, especially like race or what's going on in America today, there really isn't just a right or wrong perspective, or it's not black or white, or it's not like just the Republicans or just the Democrats have all the solutions to it. It's way more detailed and complex than that. So complex, that would be a thing to add into like nuance too, that it's like the shades of gray, all these little differences. And I think most Americans don't neatly fit into just like Republican or Democrat or liberal or conservative, even though they might kind of identify with those tribes. Generally, most people have quite a bit more common ground than they maybe would care to admit, and we live more in those shades of gray, but we tend to like and gravitate towards the binary choices. So two important terms there. And then the third one I put up on this slide is critical thinking. Please know that, like, yes, I do have bias, and yeah, I'm part of tribes, and we kind of went over that last week. And I'll tell you my perspective on a lot of different issues, but I try really hard to like leave my bias out of my teaching and instruction. My most important thing for you to get out of this class is I want you to think critically. That critical thinking piece. I don't care if you agree with me or not. In fact, I usually have more fun in classes where I have a lot of students that disagree with me. I've never marked anybody down or held any beef or grudge against the student that has a different opinion from me. So by all means, feel free to disagree with me when we're having like discussion threads or things like that, or when you're taking a stance and writing on an issue for class. I mostly care that you're thinking critically and that you can back up your opinions. So like that could be an exam question I'd put out there. Like, what's the most important thing Taluki wants you to get out of humanities class? It's that I want you to be able to think critically. I want you to do a lot of critical thinking throughout the class. And really, I don't care what your opinions are per se, but I care that you are able to like analyze them and think deep about them and back them up. All right. Okay. Moving on. So like kind of the origins of maybe racism, or it ties into tribalism too from last week, is, you go back into ancient history. I think it's kind of baked in us almost at a genetic or like, a really just base level, that we often see somebody that doesn't look like us and we think stranger danger. You go back 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 years ago, if there was a group of people showing up on the horizon coming over the hill and they have a different skin color or different eye color, or they look different than you, they have a different god, or, just a totally different culture, usually that meant danger in the ancient world. They were probably coming to rape and pillage and, steal your stuff. So I think kind of for good reason, knowing like humanity's past, we are skeptical of people that look and act and speak differently than us. Now, in modern times, you see people that look different than you coming into the port, getting off a boat or getting off an airplane. Today in America, that doesn't mean they're coming to rape and pillage and steal all your stuff. But yet we still kind of have that deep urge to resist and be scared of those that we don't understand and that look different and have a different culture than us. So no, it goes really deep back into human history. I think at one time it was probably a necessary, mechanism working in our brain for us to survive. But our rational brains today, well, most people, I think, would agree in America that, racism is bad. You shouldn't judge a book by its cover. That, people are coming in and they have a different culture, they speak a different language. Generally, they're not looking to murder you anymore. But that's in the modern world. And I think the way our brains had kind of been programmed from generations and millennia, that really comes into conflict with our rational brain today in the world we live in now. All right. So getting into like the American experience here, obviously in America, race and slavery are intertwined, especially for the beginning period, the colonial period on up to like the Civil War. So for a couple hundred years. So in 1619 in the Virginia colony, that was when the very first black slaves came to the continent and were basically made slaves for life. Before that, in the early 1600s, you did have indentured servants that were like poor white Englishmen that had no opportunities in England. They would come over here, but they couldn't afford like the boat ticket over. So a richer planter person would pay for their ticket, and they would have to agree to work like 5 years or 7 years, 10 years maybe. And then after that, they'd get their freedom. Now you had instances early on in the colonial period where poor whites and poor blacks would band together and try to have like a revolution or, get their freedom. Well, the ruling class didn't like that. So they thought to simplify it, let's keep no more indentured servitude. They kind of phased that out where the whites would be kind of slaves for a period of time. And they started importing black slaves. So from 1619 on, there starts to become a flood of black slaves being brought over and now it's very simplified in the American experience that like, if you're black and you were down in those southern colonies, you were going to be a slave for life. And they could identify you by the color of your skin. If you were white, you might be poor, you might be working on a richer person's farm, but you did have your freedom. So know that like in world history, you go back to like Rome or go to ancient China, like slavery was not just an American thing. Slavery was on all continents and basically all ancient cultures, but generally it was not tied to race. that's kind of a more unique American thing. Like you go back to ancient Rome, most of the slaves in Rome were white. And there were examples you could find of rich Africans, rich black people in Rome that owned white slaves and stuff. That's kind of rare, but it did happen. It was not at all tied to like race. But in America, we definitely tie that experience of slavery to race, and they become very deeply intertwined. So America had that racial-based slavery. You might want to like jot that into your notes. And then, of course, that all ends. The country has major tensions going on in the early 1800s, where a lot of people felt like slavery is immoral and wrong. That more is in the northern states, the Yankees. The Southerners wanted to keep that because their economy was kind of based on it. So we end up having a civil war, the bloodiest conflict in American history. By the end of that war, the result is one of the big takeaways: slavery is done in America. All right, so moving on, the post-slavery America, where I think in a lot of ways racism actually increases in this time. Excuse me, taking a sip of my coffee. So after slavery ends, you have the Reconstruction era where Union soldiers were down south. And for a while, things got better for blacks living in the South. But as soon as those Union soldiers withdrew from the southern states and stopped protecting them and watching out for them, then you enter the Jim Crow South. Jim Crow is a very important term that I'll hear get thrown out in modern day political conversations. So Jim Crow, that is kind of a slang word for any law. It's talking about any law or, like legal system down in typically the southern states that was racial based, like laws that discriminate against black people. So if you hear Jim Crow, like I would want you to associate that with basically the South after the Civil War on through to the 1960s. That's the Jim Crow South period. And there was systematic racism for sure at that time, where there literally were laws that said, blacks and whites don't mix. That was like the segregation period. So you'd want to know what Jim Crow means. Be able to have that, account for it in your notes. I'd probably have some sort of an exam question or a quiz question coming up on that. Then you have a period where like lynchings go way up. A lynching is like mob justice. I have some kind of grisly graphic photos on this slide that you can check out. That's something we could probably do a day or two, just talking about examples of lynchings. And it's some pretty graphic, horrific stuff. If you had my U.S. history class, you'll remember the bottom left picture there is Emmett Till. That was kind of that particular lynching of a black boy in Chicago that had whistled at a white woman and then gets horrifically murdered for it. That kind of sparks the civil rights movement. So anyway, lynchings are like mob justice. That's a good term for you to have in your vocabulary too. And I'll still hear that get thrown out today, where they'll talk about lynchings, although they're quite rare in modern America. You go back to, early 1900s. This is many decades after slavery, on into like the 1940s, 50s, 60s. Lynchings were all still shockingly common in that time period, and generally racially charged too. Usually it was a white mob showing up, coming after a black guy that had usually it was two reasons they'd get lynched. Most lynchings, it was either they had done something inappropriate with a white woman, okay, because black men and white women, especially down south, that was like a very taboo thing that was not allowed. Or they were working on a white-owned farm and they demanded like higher wages. They wanted to get paid better. Those two things, if you were a black guy down south in the early 1900s to mid-1900s, that could lead to a lynching. So pretty horrific way to go out and rotten part of American history. Okay, so all of that racial tension for basically 100 years after the Civil War, from 1860 on up into the 1960s, kind of culminates and it boils over into the civil rights movement. We're going to do some comparison later in the week between the civil rights movement of the 1960s and then what's playing out in America today, 2020. So like two important laws that you might want to just jot down. And this kind of marks the end of not necessarily the civil rights movement, but it marks the end of like the Jim Crow South. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Those two federal laws said that you cannot discriminate against people based on the color of their skin or their gender. You can't permit people from voting just because they're black or have double standards. Now, there were still Jim Crow laws on the books, later on after those two laws, but typically like throughout the late 1960s, early 1970s, most of those laws are getting challenged in court, and the local laws are getting struck down because now they're violating federal law that says you can't do that anymore. The one exception I can think of today that also is a hot button issue is affirmative action programs. You might want to jot that down. That's like that is the only real example I can think of today of a program that actually has like race baked into it. Now, typically affirmative action programs, which are used in like college admissions, usually favor people of Black or Latino descent, and they often don't favor, or they will impact negatively people that are white or Asian. We'll probably expand on that and do a whole lesson. That's something that is kind of controversial. It's still around today, and it's kind of I hear the argument for it that like, do two wrongs make a right? Is this a just thing? Should we have this in America today? So we'll come back to that, but that'd be a good thing that you might just kind of jot down in your notes and start that we'll be coming back to that. I think an essential question is, after the civil rights movement, which really kind of dies out with the assassination of Martin Luther King, has there been meaningful change to racism? I hear both sides arguing yes and no on this, and making some pretty convincing claims. One group says that, after the civil rights movement, that, we were starting to live up to the high-minded ideals of the American Revolution and Declaration of Independence. And yes, you'll have racist individuals, but no, the system isn't racist anymore. And then I'll hear the other side say that, you know what? Yeah, we've gotten rid of the Jim Crow laws, but really, Black people aren't much better off today than they were back in the 1960s or before. The laws are phrased differently, and they don't have race baked into them, but you still get the same outcomes. So that's a pretty important question that I want to really kind of cycle back to, and we'll probably hit a lot more throughout the unit. All right, so modern America. This is really what I wanted to start digging into, and this will tie into your journal questions today. And then on the next slide, I'll actually lay out the journal the questions that you're answering for Journal 5. So race is obviously, unless you've been living in a cave for the last 6 months since kind of shutdown started, man, race is a really red hot issue leading into the 2020 campaign and, the presidential election and everything, all the issues facing America. I think it rivals the whole COVID shutdown for like race, and then the protests and riots and COVID, I think, are the two biggest issues kind of playing out in the country right now. What are the differences between the 1960s and 2020? I think we'll do another lesson later in the week where we're going to look at like Martin Luther King's version of the civil rights movement in the 60s and compare and contrast it to what's happening with Black Lives Matter in that organization and the protests of 2020. There are some similarities, but there's a whole lot of differences too. If you hadn't heard the name George Floyd yet, again, you probably, I think you're living in a cave, because I'd imagine everybody has probably seen the video of the George Floyd murder where he was killed. Apparently, to sum it up super quick, he had used a counterfeit $20 bill at a little bodega, like a party store. And the owner called the police on him, and he was out in his car still out front. And the police officers, when they showed up on the scene, tried to get him to step out of the car. They were talking to him. That's not all on video, but apparently it got heated. They tried to arrest him. He somewhat resisted, although that's kind of debated exactly what went down there. Anyway, what's not debated at all and was caught on film, and if you haven't seen this yet, you might want to go look it up, even though it is kind of disturbing and graphic. They held him on the ground and had George Floyd cuffed, and an officer of the Minnesota Police Department kept his knee on his neck, even though he was saying he couldn't breathe and was screaming out and asking to be set up for 8.5 minutes. So pretty, man, I don't know how you would justify that. And it sparked mass outrage since the police officer has been arrested. He's lost his job and he's awaiting trial. But man, that really, it was the spark that ignited all the racial tensions that are playing out here. Have played out over the last few months. So that led to the big political movement of defunding the police. aka police reform. Now, I hear people argue that both ways. That's something that we'll probably zero in on a little bit more and get into that whole aspect of the race movement going on. What does defunding the police mean? What do they really want? I think most Americans would agree, maybe probably most of us in this class would agree that you got to have some kind of law enforcement. But then I think a lot of people feel like police in America, are they racist? I mean, I doubt all police officers are, but our departments, do they target and do racial profiling where it's unfair to a certain segment of the American population? So that's something we're going to dig deeper into later on, and probably do some looking at some different articles and videos and try to explore both sides of that issue. Then you have Black Lives Matter. That's kind of the focal point, or the big organization that's leading like the racial protests today. Now, I want to make a distinction too. So Black Lives Matter there's the concept, and then there's the organization. Like Black Lives Matter as a concept, just saying that like black people's lives have been undervalued in America's past, and maybe are undervalued today, and trying to bring attention to that. I think most Americans probably agree with that yeah, Black Lives Matter. And then there's Black Lives Matter, the organization, which has been accused of being very radical. It's not like the civil rights movement of the 1960s, where Martin Luther King was kind of like the figurehead. This one is less organized and less structured, although they do have a website and they are an official organization and do have a panel of leaders. But there is kind of a distinction between the two things, the concept and the organization. So be aware of that. And then if you haven't tuned into this at all yet, here's some semantics, like just talking about the words and how the words, even though most people would probably agree with both of these phrases, this is a very charged issue where I've seen people like literally come to blows and fight each other. I mean, go look up some YouTube videos on it where you'll see Black Lives Matter protesters versus All Lives Matter protesters, which, on the surface, getting into just the semantics of it, like most Americans, I would think, would agree with both of those phrases. Yes, Black lives do matter. So do white lives, so do Asian lives, so do Latino lives. But you got to kind of be careful how you say that today, because people are just, man, that is a hot button issue. I don't think there's anything that's a more charged issue in today's political atmosphere than kind of Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. So like if you say All Lives Matter, even though on the surface, the words of that just, you would think mean exactly what you're saying, all lives matter, which I think almost everybody would agree with. A lot of people feel like you are taking a stance and saying Black lives don't matter by saying all lives matter. So again, that's a semantics type thing. That's something that we'll try to dig into a little bit more later on too. But definitely a really charged issue going on in 2020, coming up to the presidential campaign. So I think some key questions here are, we're going to eventually look into stats a little bit more. Are Black men targeted by the police? That's something the narrative playing out would say absolutely yes. We see a lot of examples of it, and there's a lot of names that get shouted out at the protests. But I do want to look at like the actual data and look at the numbers of that too. So that's something we'll dig a little deeper into as this unit unfolds. And then another big question is, where is this all going? What are the solutions that are being put out there? Like, do you think are racial tensions going to ease up? Are things going to get better, or are they going to get worse? Does it kind of depend which way the election goes? I'm curious what a lot of your thoughts are there too. All right. So for today's journal, the assignment for you today is I want you to go open up your Google doc that is for humanities journals. Go down. You should have 4 in at this point. If you're missing any of those first 4, go back and check out my stream of assignments and get those made up. For journal number 5 today, do you think humans have a natural tendency towards racism at some basic or evolutionary level, or not? So that kind of goes back to the first slide in the beginning, what I was talking about on the notes here today. Do you think it's just like a natural tendency for humans to kind of sort of be racist, whether they're aware of it or not? Or do you think our rational brains should, trump over that, that kind of base evolutionary, skepticism of other races. What do you think there? Are humans naturally racist or not really? Give me some thoughts. Try to give me a detailed answer on that. Number two, how close have you followed the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests unfolding? Some of you might be a really short answer there. Maybe you haven't followed it at all. Others, I'd imagine, have been following it quite a bit. Tell me what your thoughts are on that. If you have been following it, tell me what your thoughts are on how that's all playing out. Number three, have you ever seen racism in your life or in your community? Doesn't necessarily mean, I'm not asking you if anybody's ever been racist to you, although that could be part of your answer. I just mean, have you ever seen it? Have you watched it? In your family or friends or in your neighborhood? Have you heard people tell racist jokes? Have you heard people say racist things to other people in the community? Again, you can leave specific names and stuff out of that. I'm not trying to, report this or anything or get anybody in any trouble. I want you to be able to just speak freely and know that I'll be the only one reading these. This isn't going to be a publicly posted comment, but I'm curious what you have to say there, what your experience in your personal life and in your community has been. And then number four, do you think we're in a very tense, racially charged atmosphere in America right now? Do you think, are things going to get better or worse? What's your prediction there? Explain your answer. If you have any questions about any of this, hit me up. I hope you found it interesting, and get ready. We're going to dive into this topic a little more and expand on some of the things that I just touched on today. We'll get into it in more nuance and detail in the near future. Take care.